good, don't you?
My current complaint.
Okay, our regularly scheduled special meeting for January 27th is in session. You have the agenda in front of you. Are there any changes? Suzanne has requested an executive session for tonight afterwards. So when we get done with this, and we can make the motion at the end to do that.
For what?
Lowry settlements or issues or. All right, this is our joint meeting with the Planning Commission. They're going to give us an update of what's happening, I think. Dave is going to give us an update of what's happening.
Dave may start it out. Okay, I'm going to start with something that I actually think Pavlos initiated and Julio endorsed, and then pretty quickly the rest of the Planning Commission did too, as an outcome of our meeting in August, addressing what our charge was, or how we saw our charge, and how you saw us fulfilling it. It's just a simple statement. Our charge is to update the current comp plan one neighborhood or area at a time, seeking significant public input and being open to restructuring the boundaries for the neighborhoods along the way, but fundamentally keeping the current format. Progress, what we've done to date. Most of you are probably aware we spent several months doing what some people would call spinning our wheels. We like to think that we were trying to learn more about Littleton, its place in the overall community, planning and community development, so that we could talk intelligently with staff, among ourselves, eventually to the public. More to the point, so that we could talk reasonably with each other and listen attentively to each other, so that when we go out to the public, we can ask questions that will provoke substantive responses rather than yes or no answers, so that we understand the perspective of the people who are offering those opinions, not because we want to prioritize them according to their position as property owner, business owner, resident, or otherwise, but so that we understand where they're coming from and can put their opinions into context. That may have seemed to take a lot of time, but by this fall we are in a position to start getting into the details of comp plan update. Not edit, not a rewrite from scratch, but an update. In order to do that, we started off by deconstructing the existing comp plan as it addressed the central area. Each of us looking at the goals and policies, providing feedback. We developed a matrix on which ones we thought were still valid, which ones were out of date, which ones we thought could be improved upon, where the comp plan had missed issues. We developed a consensus draft, if you will, which I think, Dennis, you included in the handout. That is still a work in progress, but it was an attempt to arrive at a commission viewpoint on the issues that needed to be addressed, goals, policies, whatever you want to call them, about central area to be presented and discussed in the community. We're in the process now of specifically measuring those draft goals and policies against the existing comp plan goals and policies for the central area. We've identified at least one outright conflict. There are a couple of items in the existing comp plan that are probably out of date and doesn't need anybody's attention anymore. There are a couple of things that have been accomplished, a couple of things that are still in progress. Quite frankly, we were surprised recently to realize just how little of the proposed adjustments to zoning and community development proposed in comp plan have been languishing. Nothing's happened with them. Now, there may be reasons for that, practical and political, but that's what we're in the process of doing now, so that we can finalize a draft for discussion in the community, believing that we have covered all the bases. One of the things we did as part of that is re-examine the map of central area. And I think that also, unfortunately, or for better or worse, was included in the handouts. That was an early attempt for us to understand central area, not just as outlined in comp plan, but as we, as members of the community, applied our own perspectives to what we thought of or thought the community would think of as a central area in Littleton. In the end, the details of the actual outline aren't going to matter as much and aren't going to vary as much from existing comp plan as what that map might suggest. What it does suggest is that we've come to recognize that it's not just what happens within the boundaries of the central area or any other neighborhood that are important. We also have to address the influences and the impacts between the central area or portions of the central area and the surrounding neighborhoods. That's just as important as what happens between sub-areas within the central area or any other neighborhood. So that was an awareness that came out of that early exercise, and I think is going to help us in reaching out to the community, which is where we are now. We're still going to be proceeding with refining the draft document, with going through more detail in the comparison to comp plan so we know how we measure up. But right now our focus is on developing our outreach program. In order to do that, we've essentially broken down into 1- and 2-person committees so we can work outside of the public meeting process and then come back and develop proposals, test them against the rest of Commission's viewpoints, get more input, and make progress. We've adopted a rather rigorous timeline that requires us to have documentation ready to put out to the public, and specifically survey questions. And some of them aren't going to be just questions. Discussion points that we hope will provoke informed and well thought out feedback from a range of community members, residents, businessmen, visitors, shoppers, employees. The goal is to get that feedback from the public before the summer starts scattering people on holidays, so that we can then review everything, evaluate everything we hear back through this outreach program, finalize a draft proposal, and be prepared to bring that to council early in the fall. So that's our timeline. I think rather than me go on, that'll surprise everybody. I know, Julio. I'm going to turn. I know. I'm going to turn some of this over to the commissioners who are working on specific portions of developing this outreach plan.
Before you do that, Dave, Can I interrupt you for a second? I realize I've been a terrible host and I haven't introduced everybody. And I think we all know each other, but let's do that just to be sure. I'm Doug Clark.
Jim Wood, City Manager.
I'm Jim Taylor, representing District 1 in the city.
John Ostermiller, Council Member at Large.
Jose Trujillo, District 2, Councilman.
Steve Bockenstead.
Dennis Wayne, the Acting Director of Planning Department.
Norm Brown, one of the planning commissioners.
Pavlo Savropoulos, Planning Commissioner.
David Metcalf, long-winded Chairman of the Planning Commission.
Julio Terrari, Planning Commission.
Bert Samuelson, Planning Commission.
Linda Knapke, Planning Commission.
Debbie Brinkman, District 4.
Peggy Cole, Council Member at Large.
Tom Mulvey, Councilman.
Thank you. Now I feel better.
I didn't stop long enough for you to even get a word in it. Okay. Julio and Pablos have been working on the overall outreach strategy, the means we're going to be using to try and contact and get feedback from various diverse portions of the community. So, Pablos, Julio seems to have deferred, so it falls on you.
In your package, you have received a document. It was an early draft document that Julio had drafted following a conversation that he and I had on the working group. That says Outreach Program for the Central Neighborhood. What I'm passing around to you is a updated draft, one of the things that I think is implied in a lot of what David said is we are actively working on things. So even something that we may have delivered, you may have seen that is 1 or 2 weeks old, may have been revised. But we wanted to describe a little bit some of the outreach efforts that we're thinking. And the timeline is set is fairly ambitious, and it's our goal to have a first draft completed in January, to work on completing a survey by mid-February and circulating it, have the survey collected and processed and finalized by the end of March. In mid-April, we wanted to hold an open house to discuss some of the results of the survey and some of our findings from it, as well as receive some additional input. Have a public hearing in May of 2009. Amend the final draft, incorporating all the comments, and then delivering our end of the final product for the central area to council in June. We recognize that's fairly ambitious. If we have any significant other business coming in front of us, that may have to be pushed. But we also wanted to develop an ambitious timeline and really push ourselves to meet it as much as possible. We had a lot of discussions on issues of outreach and how we would collect feedback from the public and from the citizens of Littleton. And one of the things that we realized is that there isn't any single mechanism that would work for everybody. So we wanted to have a diverse approach, having a more structured survey that would allow people to answer some questions. That seemed like a fairly obvious thing to do, and believe is that Dennis Wayne and other staff are working at this point in communicating with some professionals in the area that can help us provide some assistance in developing the survey. But we also wanted to have almost the opposite of that, an open house that would be a very unstructured environment where we may be able to get some feedback and people coming in and telling us what they want. I'm working with Kelly Nardi and Kathy Weaver. I met with them and with Dennis this morning in seeing how we can also use the Littleton website as a way of incorporating some more open-ended feedback. We will plan to have, of course, a public hearing as we're required to, but we also wanted to incorporate some direct face-to-face interviews with certain key stakeholders and other people that we felt we wanted to make sure we get some more detailed input. And it's our hope in this that we'll be able to get as broad and as a diverse feedback from folks as it is possible. Some people may be perfectly happy filling out a survey or giving us comments via the website or via email. Others may prefer to attend a meeting. But an open house or a public hearing happens at a specific time and a specific date. Not everybody's going to be able to attend that. And some people can be intimidated to come into an open environment like that. What you see here as outreach resources is really an attempt of looking at what are some of the existing mechanisms within the city, whether those are official, unofficial, whether they're private or different groups and associations, of people who already communicate with the folks that we want to. So we've got Channel 8, we've got print media, we've got several different organizations that have electronic newsletters. Littleton Community Retreat has a newsletter. Historic Downtown Littleton Merchants Association has an electronic newsletter. Town Hall Arts Center, Chris Gibbons with Business and Industry Affairs. That's an incomplete list. That's more of the idea. There are different groups that already communicate with folks. So we wanted to go out and ask all those groups to help us get the word out. Instead of everything being dependent upon us to get the word, there's a lot of other folks who communicate with citizens, and if they would help us with this, and because they are diverse constituencies that are also being represented by different groups. Some folks are geared more towards businesses, someone may be towards visitors. Town Hall Arts Center, for example, may have a mailing list that may consist of a lot of people who are not necessarily citizens or residents of Littleton. Nevertheless, if they come to downtown Littleton and they participate in some of the activities, that's feedback that we want to collect. The products and discussion list a little bit is the survey, flyers, of course, as another way of getting the word out, website, open meeting, direct interviews, and public hearing. We talk, and then we've been trying to put together a assessment of who may be the different stakeholders. Actually, Linda and Norm have done a far more thorough assessment of who are the different stakeholders in the area. One of the things that we realize is that there is, or I say, we don't feel that there is a way that we can do a really scientific methodology where we can poll people and get exact results. We will have to make some judgments. We're going to get a lot of different opinions from a lot of different people, and we will have to weigh in a subjective manner all those different opinions and feedback that we get. We want to do it in as open a way as possible, so that if someone disagrees with our weighing, at least they know what our reasons have been. But to try to really pretend that this is an entirely, or it can be an entirely objective process, I think we felt as a commission that that's really not possible. And to recognize it's subjective and recognize that we're going to make some judgments that other people may disagree with, and in the end, that's going to be the final product that the Planning Commission would put together to then forward over to you, City Council, and then you will have to go through your own process of how to evaluate everything. But hopefully we'll be able to give you all the feedback and all the comments and all the opinions and the suggestions that we have received from the citizens, as well as an accounting of the process. So again, if you feel that we have weighed something too strongly or not strongly enough, you can make your own assessment and your own suggestions, and you'll understand how the process is and work with that fairly transparently. And Julio, I don't know if there's anything else you want to...
Yeah, the only thing I want to say is...
Julio, can I get you to put on the microphone, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
The only thing I believe was missed was the actual location of the central area, in case those are on TV that don't have a clue of what the heck we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. The border on the east is Windermere, and approximately, let's see, that's the eastern border. So it goes from Lake Avenue from the south to Berry Street on the north, proceeding westward all the way to Santa Fe Boulevard is one large area. And then on the northwest side, on the southern side I should say, goes all the way down to the southern part of Hudson Gardens. To the north goes all the way to the city limits on the northern tier, in other words where Santa Fe and just above Bellevue exists, and then it follows the city boundary at that point.
Do you have a map on your...
I do, and if I could put it up, that'd be helpful.
That'd be great. Or we have a camera that in theory works.
I don't know how it works, but I'd be more than happy to
I don't know that
give it to somebody that does.
I have no idea how to turn it on.
I thought Tom was going to show me.
Does anybody know?
Apparently no one else does.
14 people technically.
Let's see what we got.
Kelly and Kathy won't let us touch anything.
Are you back again? I'm watching
Power
you.
on.
Go for it. Ooh, I got my mic on.
should be on. Somebody didn't pay their electric bill.
You keep all of the stuff, so definitely, especially
Allow me to look at this while, so I don't make too many mistakes. Like I said, on the northern tier is the city boundary, and then on the western side, there's actually an overlap, if you will. Part of the area goes to the Platte River, and then there's a segment of that which is still further to the west, which is a subdivision, and I don't have the name of the subdivision, I apologize. Does anybody know what the subdivision name is in that particular, where the golf course is?
In the green, the PDR.
That green area?
Yeah.
Part of it is Centennial Downs.
Okay, that all being said, that's the area that we're talking about tonight. I just want to make sure that's clear, and I've stole your copy.
Oh, is that fine?
And I'm going to add something. Pavlos mentioned just a few minutes ago, these are products in progress. Things change. And what current thinking of the commission is that blue area in the center is the central area proper. What we've done with those other two areas that Julio has just outlined, to the east and the northwest, is recognize that those two areas, while parts of separate neighborhoods, are intimately involved with and affected by what goes on in the downtown area, the downtown portion of, and the entire area of the central area. So what we're trying to do is show that we're looking beyond this. We're not dealing with the central area, nor do we intend to deal with any other neighborhood area in isolation. So that's the thrust of the document you're looking at.
The key thing, if I say on that, and it's a perfect example that's come in the last few days or week, is because I live in the east area. When RTD has announced that they plan to charge for parking in the downtown parking lot for the light rail station, we know, a lot of us who live in that area, that what's going to happen is people are going to start parking in the residential areas that is east of downtown. So there's decisions that get made within downtown are going to have direct impact in the surrounding areas. So a lot of what we try to do is to say we can draw those hard lines on those hard bound areas, and at some point we have to confine ourselves within us. But life doesn't work that way. People move back and forth, and you have a lot of things. So how do we identify those surrounding areas that are going to be affected, and how do we address that impact? The other thing in terms of the outreach that I did not clarify is one of the reasons why we were very interested in looking at the central area as our first area is not simply because we were asked to do so by council, is we feel that the central area also provides a perfect test for a lot of the things that we want to do. The central area has a business of large private as well as public employers. You've got EchoStar, you've got Arapahoe Community College, you've got Littleton Center, you've got Arapahoe County, you've got a lot of mixed use, you've got some private residences, you've got some historic areas, you've got small businesses, large businesses. It's a real mix. So in many respects, in anything that we'll have to look at for the rest of the city, we're probably most likely going to look at within the central area. The other thing is, and that ties in directly to outreach, is that the central area is something that a lot of citizens in Littleton feel that they have a stake or an involvement or an interest in, whether they live or work in the area. So it is our intent when we do outreach to, of course, focus very much within the central area itself, as well as the surrounding areas that we feel are being directly affected and influenced, but also to seek input from everybody and anybody within the city, as well as people from outside the city who visit or shop. I think Norm and Linda will talk a little bit about some of the distinctions between folks who are here and folks who are visiting, and use that as a test ground. So as we're moving into the other areas and to the other neighborhoods, we can begin to tell what worked fairly well and what didn't. So this is a way in which we learn how the process is, as well as inform the rest of the city and the citizens of how this process could go.
Probably a good point to segue. Linda and Norm have been working on identifying, actually they've stopped using the word stakeholders, participants, whatever the terminology, looking for people who have an interest in both the primary area, the central area proper, as well as the secondary areas, the areas to the east and the northwest and out and beyond that. Linda, Norm, which one of you want to?
I'll address that. Linda and I got together. Stakeholder, I guess I suggested, implies ownership there. We wanted to deal, as I believe the Colorado revised statutes indicate for a comp plan. Also, they require tourism to be considered in a comp plan. And so we have visitors to the downtown area. Some are employees of government agencies that are visitors. And then, of course, residents, and then there's businesses that occupy a place, either retail location or manufacturing still in some instances. So we titled our chart, I guess you'd call it, Area Participants. I'll pass around copies, and broke it into two categories, visitors and occupants. And there's some overlap between the two. We've assigned a few groups into various categories. As of our meeting last night, I prepared a list using those categories of quite a few more. An example, I guess, of what one of the considerations would be is the property owner who says parking is a problem because there's not an open space often enough in front of my business. But if you are surveying also retail shoppers and they say no, parking's not a problem, then you can assess both situations and see if you do have a problem perhaps or if you don't. We included almost everybody we could think of for this group, and this is a format, I guess, that will translate into other neighborhoods. Of course, some neighborhoods really don't have much in the way of particularly any manufacturing or larger businesses, but then, of course, we used to have Marathon, and Nordgren still occupies a large piece. And then when you get into South Park, you've got Quest and some other larger businesses down there, small retail in some neighborhoods. This is a plan, I guess, I would say that is a form we can use. Part of our struggles here in the central areas to develop something that will translate into other areas. And with any luck, the other areas will fit these templates, these ideas, and fall into place better. But it should be clear if we have this many categories for the central area and we get to another neighborhood or a corridor, if we're missing some group of occupants, visitors, it should be apparent because we won't have anything in the category there, and we can at least recognize that no, there are no RTD visitors because this is a residential neighborhood and it doesn't have a bus stop even, something like that. But we can look at each category, and what you have lists a few of them. As I say, we've got, and Dennis has this now, but since the meeting was just last night, I used his master list of, which had predominantly homeowners associations. That we just put as a category, not identifying the particular ones for the downtown or the central area. But as we go neighborhood to neighborhood, the applicable ones will fall in there, and then we will survey them and engage them, maybe go out to an open house at one of their meetings. I guess that's it. Anything else?
I think we're fast approaching, we recognized this last night, we're fast approaching the point where the two groups have to start merging their ideas. The various means for outreach and information evaluation that Julio and Pablos have been working on have to come together with the target groups that Norm and Linda have been focusing on, so we can decide which groups will be reached or might be reached or respond to, which means, and if we have gaps, what do we do to make them up? We were brainstorming some of that last night. One of the other things we did, and even though it isn't on here, I'm going to mention it. The commission thought it was important not to just take the draft proposal that we had come up with, but to challenge that thinking. Look at it again and say, are we missing something? Is there something else we need to show to the community, to present to the community as alternative ways of looking at things? Stimulate their thinking on the range of possibilities. So Kurt and Kevin Kostoff, before he left us, started developing a list of things that may not have been covered in what we were calling our draft. That's going to be the something we take into consideration when we start defining what we're going to put in the survey, what we're going to use as stimulus points in the open houses and other public meetings. So it was kind of trying to step aside and take an outside perspective instead of just a linear process. Anybody think of anything we haven't covered as far as what we've done, where we are?
I did ask Dennis a couple questions yesterday about this. One related to definitions. He said somebody in the group was working on that, so you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, one of the things we discovered in going through this is not only was the terminology in ComPlan and some of the other documents we looked at vague, glittering generalities, could mean very different things to different people, or could be taken to mean anything somebody wanted it to mean. So definitions, consistency in language is something we've been looking at. We started off by putting together, drawing on the glossaries that already exist in city documents, ComPlan, zoning, or the zoning ordinance, even borrowing from the downtown design standards, which has its own glossary, looking at what was developed in Littleton 2030, looking at Dr. Cog and what they've done. And what we quickly discovered is a lot of that is so esoteric that we don't really need it, even internally, much less for public discussion. Nevertheless, we've decided we're going to keep that list so we at least know where to look for those terms should they come up. What we're trying to do now then is backfill. Go back and look at definitions that are usable and look at the ones that, yeah, we have to have them in there, but either how it's defined doesn't fit what we see going on around us, or the definition is, again, too vague. People tend to use in all those documents things like efficiency, optimized. What was the one we were talking about the other day? In harmony with. You can make anything of those. The other thing we found, quite frankly, is people talk about areas, sub-areas, sub-neighborhoods, neighborhoods, central area, downtown area, back and forth with very little consistency. One of the goals of this process, the public outreach, what we've been doing for our documentation, our final documentation, is to be consistent so that when we use a term or a phrase, we mean the same thing every time. So that's where we are on that.
Thank you.
Jim?
How much consideration have you given to perhaps changing some of the boundaries for these districts? Because looking at this map and what Julio described a while ago, parts of that area I wouldn't ever consider central area, frankly.
And I think that's the realization we're coming to as well. As I said earlier, what we're trying to do is define central area versus the areas that are inescapably impacted by or influenced by central area. Quite frankly, one of the things we've recently come to recognize is we're going to face the same problem within the central area. If you look at the existing comp plan, it has 3 sub-neighborhoods. If you look at the downtown design standards, it has 8 different areas that cross over those 3 sub-neighborhoods within comp plan. If one of the things we're trying for is clarity in the comprehensive plan, both for existing owners, residents, business operators, and those who are coming or prospective newcomers, we need to start looking at minimizing the conflicts between overlapping boundaries. So that's one of the things we're talking about. One of the things we've talked about early and often is, as part of the outreach program, ask people to identify themselves, not just as business owner, employee, shopper, resident. Tell us what you think of as your neighborhood. Is it, if you lived in the downtown area or north of downtown, do you think of your neighborhood as all of that central area, just the R5 zone? If you live over in well, South Park's probably a bad example. If you live around Julio, how big is your neighborhood? Is it all the way from the railroad tracks to Windermere or beyond? Is it something smaller than that? So that's part of what we're trying to get through the outreach program, get people to self-identify.
And I think not only clarity, but simplicity. Whenever you get groups of citizens who want to look at this, not only being clear about what your goals and objectives are, but make them simple enough that they're not so difficult to try to comprehend and figure out what's really going on.
That's definitely one of the concerns, and if I may answer, we took in the initial central area neighborhood boundaries that existed, and we actually spent a considerable amount of time revisiting them, and we took in consideration that things have changed. And we struggle, for example, with issues of, you've got the PDR development that is just north of here, that is really designed to be tied into the downtown area, and was designed to tie into the light rail station and all this. So we decided that even though that was not included in the original comp plan, we needed to incorporate it, because now it had become, by virtue of the development that is in process of being built there, a part of it. We debated Hudson Gardens. Is that part of the central area or not? Well, we felt that it is enough of the part of the cultural aspect of the community and what is offering that we wanted to incorporate it and include it. There is no cut and dry way. There's no rule there that says this will be a part of it and this will not. And it's one of the things that we've said earlier. It is a bit of a subjective process, but we spend a considerable amount of time evaluating the boundaries, and in many respects the map that you have in front of you is more confusing than what we were beginning to finalize yesterday, precisely because we wanted to start out with a broad approach and make sure that we're not leaving anything out, and that we're not forgetting anything, and then beginning to narrow down, so by the time we do deliver something to the public, we have something that is concrete, simple, but also well thought out, at least from our perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the things you need to keep in mind, the stakeholders who have the biggest voice and the biggest role in this are the property owners. And I don't think you've got contacts or an outreach program set up to contact those property owners. And I think that's a must if you're going to get a comp plan passed.
John, do you have any suggestions as far as specific organizations or ways of reaching out to individuals?
You have to send a letter to every property owner in the area. I mean, you look at this, looking at the old area outlined in blue, everything's west of Santa Fe, from the north end where the line goes west of Santa Fe, down to Hudson Gardens, you got 3 property owners. That is a big section of property be owned by 3 people, and you've got to get them involved, because that's where the redevelopment's going to be, or new development.
Actually, slightly more than 3, because some businesses along Santa Fe.
Yeah, there are a couple smaller first.
There's some businesses along Santa Fe.
No, down to Hudson Gardens.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said 3.
And so, but having been through comp plans before, you've got to get the property owners involved.
So it's going to take one-to-one contact almost to drag them into
Yeah, letters, postcards, something. But you've got to make sure they are involved in the process.
And if they don't respond to the letter, you probably ought to call them, I would suggest.
Well, and that's what we talked about, the direct interviews, the more face-to-face. And actually, I appreciate your comments, because to some extent, part of that outreach document that you have in front of you is we wanted to think a little bit outside of the box and think of the ones that are not the standard mechanisms of outreach and the standard people that we can contact, and realize after your comment that in doing that, we've omitted in including well, of course, yes, property owners, because we've got county records and all those are the people that get included automatically in the process. We try to think of how do we make sure that we get everybody, not just the usual people, but absolutely property owners, business owners, residents, and everybody within the central area would be contacted.
Well, actually, I see property owners on here, but...
Yes,
But
it's just not...
category, but John's point is, some of these are so important, you're going to have to make sure you make the one-to-one contact.
Yeah, I think basically this area is small enough and the property owners are big enough that we have to...
And the direct interviews was designed precisely for that, to begin to identify people who we feel have a huge stake or a huge impact into the area, and we wanted to make sure that those are not just left into maybe they'll respond to a survey, but we also wanted to allow everybody to contribute.
Actually, we also looked at the other end of that. How do you pick up or invite into the process the casual visitors or the students who come in for classes at ACC, come downtown for lunch or do a little shopping a couple of times a week. If they don't have an organization to be contacted or aren't part of an organization like that, how do you pick up these people one at a time? Well, we're talking about maybe taking a little kiosk and moving it around to key spots around the central area so we can pick up the casual passersby who nevertheless do have some interest in the central area. So trying to cover both ends, if you will, John.
Thank you.
We probably also want to include South Suburban in some way. And I think they're...
Yeah, we did get that on as an addition last night.
Okay.
Once we started looking beyond and at that big green space on the other side of the river.
And this is definitely an incomplete list, is more designed to cover ideas, and one of the things that I have not completed doing is fully incorporating the work that Linda Norm. So the document that you've got that was passed out today is a partial merging of some of the work that Linda and Norm had done with the work that Julio and I had done, beginning to incorporate in. And we also wanted to get some additional feedback and suggestions from all of you.
So my apologies, I was looking at this rather than that.
It's a lot of information.
Yes, and we will be merging those documents within the next week or so.
Thank you.
Have you considered what's going to happen in the transit zone?
Julio, you want to tackle that? You had some pithy remarks about that 2 weeks ago.
I still have pithy.
Yes, I know you do.
The transit impact zone.
What transit area?
It was set up when that light rail station went in. So you've got a half a mile around here. A lot of it will encompass downtown central area, but then it goes out in its boundary all the way to Windermere and a little bit more. And there are restrictions in that transit impact zone.
Currently there is, and there's, not only do you have the TIZ, as we call it by as a acronym, but we also deal with the two zoning categories that are also a part of that, which is this TA and the R5. I guess I may be on an opposite side of the fence when it comes to everybody else, but my goal is to look at all of those various zoning categories and kind of start from scratch, because I think from my perspective they've evolved and they've worked for as long as they can work for, but I think it's time to look at them anew. And one of the things we're trying to, at least I'm trying to do, is to look at the central area and revamp that through the comprehensive plan, so that when we do the implementation side of this, that we'll look at those zoning categories and hopefully, from my perspective, because sitting on the planning commission, I don't know if you all have have observed it, but there's not much difference between the R5 and the CA. But when it comes down to, there's just enough differences to create a lot of repercussions, I would have to say, and more negative than positive. So I guess that's one of the reasons I want to look at it. The other thing is, and I guess I'm going to call, instead of the TIS, maybe just call it the TOD, Transit Oriented Development. We need to focus in on that as well. However, the biggest concern I have is it just also so happens to be right in the middle of our downtown area, and there's a big overlap. I mean, a lot of people that you talk to about a TOD want to see compact development, which means, you know, a lot of very strong development. Now, also saying that, and I don't want to forget this, is that we have another TIS, which is just about a mile or so down the road on minerals. So to some degree, whatever we do with the TIS in the central area will also affect that particular site, and so we have to be very cognizant when we're doing that. So I first want to look at the two zoning categories, and then I want to look at what I classify as the TODs for the city, and see if we can make some kind of a better relationship. Is probably the best way I can put it. I can't give you anything specific because I'm the only one that's speaking about this, and I'm pretty sure that any of my cohorts could either agree or disagree with me.
There's a lot of people that live within that area there that have questioned me about the TIS as to the restrictions that it implies, and what can they do, what can't they do. You know, it's a really messed up thing.
Well, I agree on the last part.
You lay another layer of bureaucracy right on top of what you have.
I think, as primarily what we've been looking at, thanks to Julio's input, is not treating that as a hard line. The impacts, the effects of that go well beyond just that radius line. You can't ignore a house just outside the line. It's going to be just as severely impacted as something else. So one of the things we're trying to do is develop a different perspective and say, look, this goes beyond just that formal half mile. There's more to it than that. How are we going to incorporate those considerations in the various prescriptions or proscriptions we propose for areas within the central area and adjacent? So that those two kind of come together there.
And it's real important that discussion also becomes part of this acknowledgement of this area and how we're going to deal with it. I think we can only go so far as a small group here on the Planning Commission to try to, we can bring up the issues, but how it's going to be represented and how it's going to be entertained by different folks is something we really still need to do and figure out. Because I'm hoping that we'll have literally arguments on both sides of the fence so we get a better idea of what all and some of the issues are as we keep plugging our way.
That area within the TIS there, I think all of those folks should be written a letter to also, because of the fact that it's going to impact them to some great degree.
Already is.
Yeah, it is. And
Well, you kind of have TIS issues and CA issues, and there's a little sense where they're different. I mean, if you're living on, say, Pavlos Street, and you want to build a room on the back of your house, you now have to go through a PDO.
Residential is exempt
Residential is exempt?
from TIS.
Is it? Okay.
It'll be more the transition areas within the TIS that would have that constraint.
Within the TIS that applies to commercial areas, they're going to redevelop the property.
So it excludes all the R stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Except to the extent that they're impacted by the redevelopment in those areas
Right.
within
And
the
that's the
TIS
reason
district.
for the TIS,
Right.
is so that they have to go through a process to get approval. They just can't do what's allowed in the zoning district.
What about R5?
Anything, R5 is exempt, I think.
I think any
Or is it single-family
I think any
residential?
single-family residential.
Single-family residential.
Okay.
We'll have to double check.
But you can still put the hammer on those people. That's the whole thing.
Well, I don't know, Jose, if you're hearing from somebody, we probably need to know specifics, because I'm not
Right.
clear what hammer they would be
Well,
affected
and what they
by.
can do to remodel, et cetera.
I think he's talking PDO on TIS and I thought it applied to residential too, so maybe that's not a concern.
People might be confused too about the
Right,
two.
well, there's not any really thing that says what they can do and what they can't do.
So it's kind of the fuzziness that bothers people.
Yeah, it's a lot of fuzz.
They can do whatever's allowed in the zone district. They just have to present a plan development overlay to make sure it fits in with the surrounding neighborhood. That was the whole purpose of it. So that somebody's not tearing down the REA building and building a new Walgreens in the standard Walgreens style that's supposed to fit in with Main Street.
If I may, just to add, because I think this ties into something else that we've been thinking in terms of outreach. Part of our goal is to create a process that gets more citizen involvement and more citizen information. So we've been talking, and actually I was meeting with Kelly and Kathy Weaver this morning and with Dennis about creating like a frequently asked questions section in the website, or having an ask planning email, so that we encourage citizens to come in and ask questions like that. And then the commissioners will get involved in trying to answer those questions, clear them with staff, make sure that we get it right. This is a process of doing both internal education, but also of communicating that with the citizens. Because there's a lot of things. I mean, if there's one relatively simple question, and within this whole entire group we cannot come up with a definitive answer, then we have a problem. And we recognize that that is an issue, and we're working to address it. So outreach is not just for the comp plan, but it is how do we involve and educate citizens about the planning process altogether, so that people feel involved and engaged in it, as opposed to alienated and hostile, which unfortunately is very common relationship or interaction between citizens and a bureaucracy. We want to smooth that out and says this is an interaction between citizens and the rules and the procedures that help the city function smoothly for the greater good.
Julio, you had something?
I have a question for the city council members. I've been going to all the meetings and trying to go to all the meetings and trying to get involved in the whole planning commission comprehensive plan process, and as you have either tuned in or tuned out as through our meetings, you've been able to observe at least what we've been trying to do. I guess the big question I have for you all is, what kind of feedback are you getting on our endeavor to this point, if any? Because we don't have standing room only when we come in to the room on any given study session night. So I'm just going to say that from our perspective, we've been kind of doing this somewhat in a void right now, and I guess I'm curious to know if you've had any reaction with any of your constituents.
Not much.
I think probably we'll get more reaction as soon as something comes out that's very stable and they can see it. Then they can make their objective remarks to it. There will be a lot of them.
I think the direction we're taking right now is the final product that currently is showing as a draft is really background, foundation for the discussion.
Right.
What we're going to be doing with the survey questions and what we post online and the stimulation points that we're going to be taking to these meetings is try and crystallize some of the big issues. Some of the issues that, quite frankly, comp plan up to now has, I don't want to say ignored, tried to talk around, smooth over, avoid hard questions. Parking. You can't ask somebody, is there a parking problem in Littleton? That gives you a yes or no answer, and it all depends on who's talking about what time of the day and what area for what purpose. You've got to be specific. You've got to provoke information that's going to be useful. You could say the same thing about circulation, the balance between pedestrians and efficient vehicular traffic and bicycles. You could say the same thing about how much open space is enough in the central area or beyond. You could say that about densities. So what we're trying to do is identify the lightning rods, Kurt, is that basically what we're looking for? That can stimulate the kind of useful input or useful diversity of opinion that'll give us something to, some meat to incorporate in the comp plan instead of platitudes. And sorry, but in a lot of cases, what is in comp plan right now as far as goals and policies tend to be platitudes. Quite frankly, the first pass that we took at it, we ended up with a lot of platitudes. So we're trying to put sharper points to that, because in the end, it's going to determine what happens within a neighborhood or within a sub-area within that neighborhood and how those sub-areas relate to each other. So that's our thinking as of the last couple of meetings.
Are you going to remove those cutesy things?
I certainly hope so. They're hard to erase because people are fond of them. Some of them sound very wonderful.
Well,
But if they don't have substance and they can't be used for evaluating a rezoning application or a PDO or any other development plan that comes in, they don't do you any good.
Well, to Julio's question, I haven't heard from a lot of constituents, on the Planning Commission information, but I've watched the meetings, and I would just say that they're hard to follow. Part of what I kind of see happening, and I saw it in the information that you gave us, and I even hear it a bit in you guys talking now, is just a lot of layers. And I know it's not a simple task, and I know it's not a simple issue, but Jim said the word earlier, and he said could try to make it simple. And that may be too simple of a word, but I think that's kind of what I'm getting from a lot of this and the struggle that you guys have been having. I think I see a little less struggle lately, but, I don't know, sometimes where's the forest through the trees? And when you zero down into a house on a block, and then you try to pull back to this, and then you put all the little layers in between, I don't think you come up with much, and particularly not much that you're going to be able to take out to the citizens and talk to them about and get what you're looking for, because it really is. It's not an easy subject to understand, only because, if you spend the time doing it, you can, but no, that's not the job of the citizens. That's not the job of, that's your job. So I think that the bigger task you guys have with your outreach is how are you going to be able to take all the knowledge you have of the detail and the specific and the math and the info and the zoning and be able to call that down to what an average citizen, and I count myself as one of those, is going to be able to actually understand, and not so much understand, but actually be able to feel like they can give you the answer that you're going to be able to use. I think that's going to be one of your bigger challenges, and it really is. It's just simple.
But without examining and recognizing the layers so that we're aware of them, it's kind of hard to come to any kind of consensus, and that's what we've been doing. That's not a linear process. We've said from the beginning it's reiterative. You go over it and try and recognize the things that are important. You go over it again, and you keep accumulating information. Sooner or later, you have to put it into some kind of form that the public can respond to without being directed, without being prescribing or stacking the deck on what you want to hear, which then puts us back in the position of getting these diverse and scattered viewpoints, which puts us right back where we were 6 months ago, and we have to bring it all back in and try and evaluate it and make sense of it. But that's a necessary part of the process. There's no way not to do that.
Building on what Debbie said, I think we all recognize the fact that we are a first-tier suburb. We're a small city. We are an enclave city. And so getting ready to deal anything in the future with comp plan has got to be focused more on redevelopment rather than brand new development. Because there's very little brand new development going to occur, particularly in this area we're talking about right here. It's going to be redevelopment.
Jim, I think one of the things we've been considering, it's been constantly in front of us, is yes, redevelopment, but also preservation. It's a mix. You've got to balance the two. There are areas that you don't want to see redeveloped. Most people's neighborhoods, they aren't going to want to see redeveloped. Peripheral areas, the commercial zones surrounding, and in a few cases, integral parts of neighborhoods, yeah, that becomes more pointed then when the two of them interrelate. We've got to discuss both. It isn't just redevelopment, it's also preserving what we have. Norm?
Could I jump in?
Yeah.
We did add on page 5 in what we handed out, the draft plan, a section on historic preservation. Part of the idea is that there is now a historic district in this central area, and there was quite a bit of contention about the nature of it, and we'd be remiss if we ignored that. I pulled some policies from a document that I got off the internet, High Springs, Florida, which reading their comp plan seems to be a lot like Littleton. They had a couple things that I thought would be helpful, and I suggested that we include them in this section. We'd lost track of one of them, but it addressed the one that got edited out, and we will edit back in, involves the city providing a staff person, which would be our historic preservation person at this point, who's knowledgeable about preservation issues, availability of grants and so on. And that was where that phrase "in harmony with" actually came from, was what they had. That a building that is going to be built, a redevelopment project, or something like the Healing Arts addition, second story, would be in harmony with the adjacent properties in a historic district. Now that's a little bit vague, but if you have a Frank Lloyd Wright project plan next to Town Hall Arts Center, I think you would find both are historic in nature but not in harmony. So we've put together this section. I guess we'd solicit your thoughts as far as that. We wanted to acknowledge, particularly in this, and there's other neighborhoods, Pablo's, of course, in his neighborhood, and then Arapahoe Heights, I think, at Arapahoe Hills. So there's a couple other historic areas that a section might be applicable in that neighborhood. That's one of the things we did. As far as feedback, it occurred to me the other night that J.C. Watt had a great quote, and that we have plenty of opportunity. His quote was about character. He says, "It's doing the right thing when nobody's watching." And I suspect when we're having planning commission meetings, frequently nobody's watching. So we'll see if we can manage to maintain our character. That was one section we added, was historic preservation. And we'll see what the citizens have to say. Of course, it's kind of a two-edged sword. Some people are extremely concerned, and I've run into that. As some of you know, I'm involved with the Friends of Historic Fort Logan, and there was thoughts of having a historic district on the grounds of Fort Logan. And representatives from the state said absolutely not. We want no shadow of control on anything that we might choose to do with these historic buildings. So you run into it frequently, and there's people in the district, surrounded by the district, that were concerned by that. You guys know the history of all of that, but we wanted to address it in this document.
Getting to the simplicity and the lightning rod thing, I think when you get ready to take this to the people, you need to tell them what the implications are of the policies that are in here. And I'm afraid that if this is the proposed central area plan, that there are some aspects of the existing central area plan that either got dropped or the Planning Commission has already decided what the implications are. And I'll give you a couple examples. One is the small town character. If you look at Goal 4 and the neighborhood goals for the neighborhood. And this is very pertinent to downtown. I guess it depends on what you define as the small town character. And we used to have a gun shop, a hardware store, we still have a feed store, we have 2 auto body places, we used to have an electric contractor on downtown. That's what I think of as small town, is a wide diversity of businesses that may not necessarily be all that pretty. What we are going towards in downtown is basically a homogenization of buildings that all look like what we think of historic buildings to be. And an example would be the tearing down of the Main Street Grill, which is a historic building, to be replaced by a new building that will be designed to look like the historic building next door. And the design guidelines, if those had been in place in the last 100 years, you wouldn't get some of the structures that already exist in downtown that contribute to the small town atmosphere. So I think you as a commission need to ferret out these issues that exist in the goals and or don't exist in the new goals, and when you bring them to the public, you need to say, what do you want? Do you want a small town that has a wide variety of businesses, or do you want something that looks more like a Gaylord, or do you want something that looks like a historic downtown on Main Street in Disneyland? One example. Goal number 1 here talks about the central areas and major activity center. Well, I understand major activity center to be where the city has its social events, like the Candlelight Walk and the other stuff that we do downtown. If that's what this means, then perhaps this goal ought to be extracted from here, because I see this in conflict with, for instance, the Main Street concept that was proposed for Littleton Village. Because if you're trying to say that downtown is where you want people to go to socialize, where you want the city to have its social activities, where you want people to have the concept of downtown, then do you want to create other main streets or small town streets around the rest of the city? And it's these sorts of issues that end up being reflected in policies here. And I'm not sure that when you bring in the public, they're going to understand when they're reading this. Third example is Goal 6. Encourage and accommodate the private rehabilitation of older residential and commercial structures. Well, we got a whole bunch of older residential single-family structures in downtown, which I think most people that drive through downtown would consider to be part of the character. Does that mean that the citizens want those types of houses to stay downtown, or do they want them to be replaced with condos or mixed-use developments? Because there's a lot of mixed-use talking here. So when you bring this, if that's what the Planning Commission proposes, is mixed use, and this is separate from what it's already zoned, then you need to point out to people what the implications are, how that's going to change what's currently down there. And then hopefully present a balanced plus and minus on both sides of the issue. Why somebody might want the mixed use, why somebody might not want the mixed use. But the first thing you got to tell them is what this goal and policy changes from the existing one and what that's going to mean to downtown. And I think you have to get it to what it means, what it's going to mean to the people for downtown, what that's going to change it to, so that the regular person can understand. And then the goals and policies are written in a way to try and implement that. Because right now you've got changes that you're suggesting in your goals and policies from what currently exists, and I'm not sure that all those changes are really visible.
And I think you've hit on the right word, suggested. We're not proposing this is what we want to do. What we're saying is, this process, this long, involved, layered process that you were talking about, took several months for us to pull apart, put back together again, and come to consensus on the points that we thought were worthy of consideration. We're not saying, this is what we want to do, let's do it, vote on it, yes or no. We do have to, and that's what we're talking about, the lightning rod points. We do have to provoke the discussion. Do you want to preserve downtown as it is? When Chris dies, is Valley Feed going to continue? Anybody want to bet? Do we want to sweep everything off and put in something that looks like a part of downtown Denver? If you're not going to do either of those extremes, how do you balance what's happening in between? What are the implications of trying to make downtown more of a regional center, which means you have more traffic, therefore need to accommodate more parking? If you're going to take advantage of the transit impact of light rail and more people coming into the downtown area, how do you then get them to go from the station out into the businesses to with their trade, or to look around the neighborhoods and decide this might be a better place to live, and then I can walk down to the station? How do you weigh those things? How do you recognize that you can't have, that whatever you do to make a regional center may detract from the small town, downtown area where it's comfortable to live and walk around and go to the same shops every day because you can walk there? If you try and preserve what's down there, where you know that the people who've operated the businesses for 50, 60 years, what are you giving up in terms of the opportunities for revitalizing the downtown with a bigger mix of businesses? Not the old mix maybe, but a new mix, a bigger mix that serves both the people living in downtown and those around it and the entire community. That's the kind of discussion we want to provoke.
I agree with you exactly.
Without dictating, without directing them toward one conclusion or the other.
Okay. One of the things we had was an example of a visual survey, which was pictures. Do you like this or do you like that? And we'd agreed last night that we would incorporate that, at the advice of somebody that's putting together some survey with credibility. But I think that speaks to what you're saying as far as approaching people and saying, do you like this single-family house, terracotta cafe? Do you like the look of this as compared to, pick a condo project that is, the one down the street here, live here, work here. There's residential above 4 units, I believe, 4 retail units. Ask people what they like. The implication of this policy would be to prefer keeping single-family units with a yard around them and the traditional setbacks, as opposed to this type of, whether it's a brownstone or what's there, a row house type of mixed-use deal. And that would be a way to address that, is using pictures. Yeah. Then we don't have to explain the differences. And we agreed that we should probably incorporate that. Our example was almost entirely a visual survey that we looked at. Then you have trouble identifying, well, what was it that they liked? The fact that there were big trees, or the fact that it was a single-family residence. So there's a little bit of interpretation involved.
And to a certain extent, we've got to take time into consideration. We could sit here, and we did last night, talking about, okay, if most people, when you say, I'll meet you downtown, think of it as being between the railroad tracks and the melting pot and right along Main Street. Somebody else might think of it as a half block or a block on either side of it, or a little farther. If that is the core of the downtown area, where is it going to be? How big an area is it going to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now? We can't predict that. We can set certain guidelines as far as trying to limit the severity of changes in that area or adjacent to that area, or control the pace of it so nobody's checkerboarding or flagpoling, in order to try and preserve some of those sub areas or the areas around it. But in the end, we're at the point where we need community input. We need to see what the community thinks about it. We might be surprised. They might come in and say they want to turn all downtown into a historical museum, or they'd rather see it totally redeveloped. I don't think so.
Or Walgreens.
Or Walgreens. I mean, I for one am interested in seeing the debate that's going to develop between, what did the Historic Preservation Board call it? Historic buildings and faux historic?
Yeah.
And the question of, is old historic or is it just old? I think that's the kind of discussions we've got to get out of this outreach.
So this particular area is a little different from other areas of Littleton because of its current focus in comp plan and its current use, as I see it, as a central activity center for Littleton. Now, I know we got the library and museum, and they're not in this little piece that's drawn off here, but at least as you ask for input from people in this initial process, I think you have to go beyond the stakeholders that you've identified here. There are quite a few people who walk a mile or more downtown to do stuff down there, to use the light rail and to go to places down there, who bicycle down there, not just along the Platte and come on over, but who bicycle down there. And so seeing, and they do it fairly regularly, so knowing what kinds of things draws them there does affect, do we indeed have good pedestrian and bicycle access, where people don't get run over, particularly when we have bad weather.
Or they have a place to park the bike.
Or park their shoes, or, but, so I hope we have that kind of further outreach. It's a little different from other neighborhoods because, unless, the residential neighborhoods, because people in the residential neighborhood have their sense of themselves. But this one, in a part, belongs to everybody.
Well, and I guess we've increasingly talked about that. I mean, there are other activity centers, if you will, Doug, around. God knows Aspen Grove has certainly become one. There are other commercial activity centers, both tending toward regional as well as being more confined toward neighborhood. The question I'd ask everybody here is, would Littleton be Littleton without downtown? Or would we just be a group of neighborhoods and strip shopping centers and that sort of thing? Regardless of the look of downtown, the mix of multifamily or single-family houses, rentals and owned properties, small businesses and large, without downtown, with all of its variety and all the activities that do occur, Littleton is not Littleton. That makes the rest of the community. So what we do down there matters to everybody.
And there is one word in here that bothers me. It's in here a couple places. Well, there are a few, but there's one that bothers me, and that's the sense of capture the regional market for local businesses. I could attract stuff, right? But capturing makes me think of some of these areas that I've gone shopping in that have captured too darn many people, and I don't go back there anymore because it's such a jam.
And that's the dichotomy we've got to address with downtown, regional, neighborhood, something historic, traditional mix, or something more.
Capturing also makes me think of the traffic jams we have sometimes down there, right?
That goes along with it.
And you can't park on Main Street because the traffic doesn't want to give you an inch to even back up at all to, so.
And that's one of the considerations in terms of balance. On the other hand, I would imagine that most people who own or run downtown businesses would say that's a problem we would like to have. Too many customers. And it is the thing of one of the concerns that's been brought up for the downtown of the central area is we do want to continue to encourage it as a residential area, yet there is very little down there that is geared towards the residents. There's no place where someone can go and buy food to make at home. There's plenty of restaurants, but there is no No grocery store. There's within the vicinity. We want to encourage pedestrian traffic, but is it only pedestrian traffic if somebody goes to a boutique or goes to a bar? What about pedestrian traffic in terms of going to a dentist office or some of those things? And what is the balance there? And one of the things that we also have to struggle with is that to some extent we can describe what we want till we're all blue in the face, but changes has happened. So Doug, you talk about the small town character. Well, that's in the original comp plan, but Valor's became a pizza bar, whether the comp plan talked about a small town or not. So we have to recognize that those changes are. So in some respects, the comp plan is not only a guiding document when we review rezonings, but it also becomes something that tries to invite certain type of development and maybe discourage a different type of development. But in the end, we are not going to do the actual development. So we can invite a kind of development all we want, but if there's nobody interested in doing that, that's not going to happen. We can try to discourage some development, but if that's where everybody's moving in, that's going to happen a little bit despite of us. That's a reality that, as unpleasant as it is, I think we have to kind of recognize we don't have that much power. We're putting together a document that we try to keep it as simple as possible without keeping it simplistic. And that's the reason why that multi-layered, I mean, you talk about being confused about what we're doing. You should see our faces. But we felt that we really had to grasp with that complexity on all those layers so that we can, in the end, produce a document that is simple without being simplistic. That's a really key difference. And are we there yet? No, not quite. But that's the direction towards which we're going. And I think you are catching us right at that transition phase where we begin to say, all right, we've put everything on the table. Now let's start clearing up. Let's start really settling things down.
As we said earlier, we've only just started testing the consensus of goals and policies that we've come up with against the existing comp plan for what did it say that we aren't addressing? What did it not say that we are addressing? What have we reworded that really is something the community is going to embrace, and what is it that we've done that's they're going to think we're going in the wrong direction, away from that. We know there are policies that we've missed. We know that we've identified issues that aren't in comp plan. Quite frankly, mixed use is addressed in comp plan. It's not a new term, just in the last 2 or 3 years. It's in comp plan. The question is, how does it fit in?
And you got a whole bunch of zoning for that too. So
that's right. So it's nothing new. I think it's more a question of there are a lot of shops that have been on Main Street for, 50 years? Probably. Some of them, there were more 5-10 years ago. Yep. Some of them have evolved into businesses that not only succeed on their own, but probably contribute to the activity, the mix that draws people downtown, and then they go shop to shop. They're down there for one thing, they look around and go to someplace else. The new restaurants do the same thing. We're not quite to the point where what in an urban area would be thought of as an urban area where the activity goes on well into the night. There are isolated pockets of that downtown, but quite frankly, until you get to a certain critical mass that businesses expect it's worth their while to stay open until 8 or 9 o'clock. They're going to develop enough foot traffic and enough purchasing to stay open because of the mix of activities that are bringing people downtown. You're not there yet. I understand there was an attempt to do the same kind of First Friday thing as Denver did, and it took a lot of arm twisting to get people to even agree to stay open. The first weekend they did it, there were like 14 or 15 businesses. A month later, it was down to about 11, and then it dropped off to 7. It's almost as if everyone was saying, well, okay, I'll try it, but show me the increase in business right now. Ain't going to happen that way, folks. It's going to take increasing diversity, redevelopment, strengthening of what we've got, and you're going to have to figure out the balance. Is short-term or restricted parking more of a help to the small businesses that need their customers to be able to park right in front or a few steps away to come in, make their purchase and leave in 20 minutes than it is a harm to the restaurants or town hall who need people to be able to park for 3 hours for a long dinner or a play and dinner, or to some of the boutique shops, the artists, the photographers, the craftspeople who are hoping that somebody will come down for a meal or down for a play and be parked there long enough that they can walk around and see what else is on offer in Littleton. That's what we're really talking about. How do we keep the small town feel that people have come to think of as Littleton and still stimulate what's going on downtown and throughout the rest of the area? That's what we're trying to do. We're ready to go out for an outreach and get other people's opinion rather than just ours.
Could you tell me a little more about your proposed survey? Is that citywide or door-to-door or telephone only, or do you know how much it's going to cost?
Yes. The short answer is yes, Tom.
We're still exploring options.
I know we had a lot of telephone-only surveys in the past and paid $5,000 for them, and they're useless.
No, we're looking at a variety of different options, and I think part of it is trying to get somebody in. A lot of times people say, well, keep survey short because that way you'll have more responses, but having more responses that don't give us enough detail and substance to use it, how useful is that? And we recognize that survey is one of the tools that we're going to use. We don't want to restrict it only to that. And frankly, I think that till we actually develop and we put it out there and see the response we get and how valid the comments and how useful the feedback is going to be difficult to assess. I'll be lying to you if I tell you that, oh no, we know exactly how much this costs. It's a bit of an experiment, but we've decided to kind of do a variety of different experiments and see what would get more response instead of focusing just on survey or just on a public hearing or just on this and then going, wow, we had an open house, we had 10 people show up. Now what? If we get phenomenal response in all of them, that's a problem we would like to have.
If a survey, Tom, is a mail-out survey or a distributed at community center survey or a web-based survey or a telephone survey, you have to do a few things before you even start doing the details. What's your target audience? What's the target information you're trying to get? How are you going to be able to evaluate it? How are you going to be able to judge the validity? The problem with a website survey is one person can go in there and put the same opinion down, expressed slightly differently 40 times.
Yeah.
So
we don't really know
how to match up right now.
We don't really know how many computers are in the homes, or how many homes have computers, I should say. Just like we know only how many get Channel 8. There's only, they say 50% get Comcast. But we don't know what that 50% is. Is that every home, or 50% of all the homes, or 50% of 70% of the homes?
That's why I said earlier, we're to the point now, we've identified the participants, we've identified the means. Now we're trying to figure out how do we contact each of them most effectively, recognizing that with a written survey, you can quantify information a little more readily. It tends to be come across as more metric, more objective. When you go to open houses and open meetings, you're going to get subjectivity. Well, there's nothing wrong with subjectivity. It tends to be more personal. You start to get flavors that you can't get from a written survey of 12 questions that has to be boiled down into statistics. We're looking at how we encompass as much as we can within the time frame we have, and with the idea that we have to produce information we can digest and put out there to the council and to the community as this is what we've heard, this is how we think we achieve the consensus in the community.
One of the options is that Kelly's offered us an insert in the Littleton report, for example, as an option.
Now that's 100%. That goes to every home.
Right. But I think, as both Pablos and Dave said, it's really going to be a combination of things. There'll be one way of getting answers, but we also need to do more detailed interviews with the key stakeholders, property owners. So it's really combining all these things so we get a different set of information. The survey that we go out in May, as Pablo said, be very short, just in order to get as many responses as possible. We'll get more details when we do the interviews, more details when we go to the open houses. So we can be combining all that information, I think, and balancing it a little bit.
Julio?
The big problem that we're faced with is our timeline. I make no bones about it. We need to get a couple of plates up in the air, and while they're up in the air, we have to be able to, those of us down here have to figure out how to do other things in the same time period so that it all kind of coalesces at one point. And that was a concept that we try to create with this small document here. This document in and of itself, even though it's only 20 pages, if you would have seen all the goals and policies that we had a couple of weeks ago, we could have increased this by, what, another 20 to 30 pages without even blinking an eye.
Probably added to layers of confusion.
And the reality of it is we went through a priority process where we limited the policies down to maybe 5 policies per element on here, just because we were getting so verbose, we were seeing the same thing coming up over and over again, and we just cut a lot of that out. I must admit, I guess I'm not looking, personally, I'm not looking for any kind of a saying, this is great or this is bad or whatever. My comment is, we want to get something out there to stimulate folks, because like you all, we haven't been receiving any kind of a response thus far, and that's a very big concern of ours. So we're trying to get this out, we're trying to get a survey out, we're trying to get all that information together, and then have an open house so that we'll have a lynch party coming in trying to find us, and then we'll try to deal with them accordingly at that point in time so that we can rule in or out the issues that they have. Because this is not anywhere close to a, I would call this a working document or a working draft. It is certainly not the final draft. It's not even close. It's a rough statement of what we could collectively do in the time period we had to come up and try to see if we can get this thing done. And I think there are a couple of caveats in here that I think I want to make sure that you all know before we all close. And that is that the first thing is, if we don't have any development between now and June, we should be working pretty smoothly. If at the end of the open house they decide to lynch us and we realize that we've really gone in a terrible tier, that means we're going to have to regroup. That's going to take some time as well. Saying that, I still feel comfortable that our goal at this point in time is to bring in more people, as much people as we can, citizens, because we're going to try to make this their document, not ours. We may have the final say of voting for it one way or the other, but the bottom line is we want to get their input. And if they're silent, that creates a real damaging approach. I feel sorry for letting us figure out what their destiny is, but that's maybe what could happen. So with that in mind.
I think you've done a wonderful job, and I thank you for all the time and effort you put into what you've done so far.
Steve?
I wanted to say a couple comments, some of the things that I've heard tonight. Jim had mentioned on how the map is kind of confusing. Basically, the map, the way it's drawn, will bring up comments. It brought up the comment about the TIS zone, and it's brought up comments on the areas of influence outside of the central area. Deb has brought up comments about and how we'd be at one individual building, and then we're up at the 30-foot level and 30,000 feet and going back and forth. But with that happening, what we're doing is we're trying to look at all of our options, trying to make sure that we looked at the close in, we looked at the far away, trying to make sure that we looked at everything for our plan.
I'm going to point out that all this discussion, everything you've seen in the way of ongoing products is missing 2 fairly significant questions that we're going to have to deal with as a commission while we're going through this outreach process. Number one, and one of the bigger charges, I think, from the City Council in undertaking this comp plan update was, why hasn't comp plan been followed or applied more faithfully and consistently recently? And I think you could probably poll each of us individually. The details might vary, but I think you're going to come up with the same general response. We had just thought we were going to get into a couple of hypotheticals and case studies to try and be able to generalize some answers for you when we decided that we really needed to focus on getting the outreach part started. But through this spring, we're going to do exactly that. The other one, quite frankly, is as we went through comp plan, there were a couple of goals. Actually, it was more specific policies that were recommended in comp plan about the central area, in particular dealing with boundaries. Should this zone be extended, this half block to this point or someplace else? And I guess after 27 years, our question is, why hasn't anything happened with that? Not just for the specific, for the educational information about why it hasn't happened, but to give us some idea of if we come up through, with all the community input, with a comp plan that starts suggesting long-range goals that may require some changes to zoning or zoning maps or land uses within areas, what is the likelihood that this city council or future city councils will undertake to implement those policies? And I'm not looking for a decision, an answer right now.
I would, reading the old comp plan and reading the proposed, and I realize this is a document in progress and things like this, I would recommend against putting action items in the comp plan because the likelihood of them getting done is pretty remote. I mean, you see that in the old one. You've pointed it out, some things in there that says we should create, I think there's an activity center plan in Goal 1. I don't know that an activity center plan was ever created. So if you want to describe something that should happen, then do it in the comp plan. Because if you put in there that we would like to have this thing occur sometime in the future, it probably ain't going to happen in the future. I mean, even with the best intentions on our part, it may not happen for a long period of time.
So keep it to general and vision stuff rather than change this street to one way or make this area a bicycle parkway instead of a street.
Changing a street to one way can get done in a short period of time. Right. Creating a design document or an action plan or something else like that could be so nebulous and take so long that it never gets done. I mean, if you guys come and say that Alamo ought to be both ways, that you ought to change Littleton Boulevard to two ways and Alamo to two ways, that's something we can vote up and down in a fairly short period of time. If you come and you say the city should undertake to do an extensive parking study to find out where to locate parking things, then thanks for the advice, but
we are due for a fourth parking study, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the things that we say in here is that we've got an urban design plan, develop an urban design plan, go for Dr. Cog and get a regional urban center designation. So there's a lot of that's happening in this plan that I'm hearing you say that we need to exclude, or we should exclude.
Well, I'm just suggesting that history tells us that the likelihood of that stuff getting done is not so good.
So small details that are easily considered, evaluated, and acted upon, yes. Overall goals or vision kind of things that everyone can work towards or we can use in evaluating redevelopment or development plans, okay. It's the in-between.
Well, having said that, Julio brought up a very good point, and that is there are aspects of our current zoning code that we know need to be looked at. And there are things that you may suggest in the comp plan that would require changes in the zoning. And part of what I think we're hoping that you will do is look at this whole process, because this is a document that we look at mainly to decide whether a rezone is to be approved or not. I mean, that's the main purpose of it. There's other things in there.
Then that first question I brought up is really the one we ought to be focusing on behind the scenes while we're going through the public.
There's something else we need to consider, though, and that is that if we go back and look at the original draft of the comp plan as it was written and adopted in '81, it had a lot more in it, a lot more recommendations, which have been taken out now. It had specific recommendations for depressing the railroad tracks, for doing a lot of things that were accomplished.
Goals
And
achieved.
as those were accomplished, those were taken out of the plan. So the current draft isn't quite accurate in terms of what was actually accomplished. There's a lot more that was actually done from those recommendations, and I think we need to think about that in terms of, which ones are probably too pie in the sky and which ones actually could get accomplished.
And I agree, as an offshoot to that, I think the fact that downtown Littleton has not been considered by Dr. Cog as a, what's the term they use? An urban center. I think that's something that we can do. We can implement that, just like you said. You can take care of the one-way street. Well, I think we can take care of that side of it as well. I guess I wouldn't put anything in here that we couldn't achieve. Anything beyond that, of course, it gets gray and gets into all kinds of other issues. That'd be a whole different ballgame. But I think there are a number of elements in here that we're looking at that we could implement, and I guess that's what we're trying to make a differentiation, if you will, in our discussion. And that's what I think how you got a reaction from, at least both Dennis and I and everybody else, because we do feel we're not going to try to bite off more than we can chew. And I guess to some degree, that's why, and I'm very glad that we're working on the central area, because in my opinion right now, of all the areas to really look at that has the most opportunity, if you will, from a positive sense, it's really the central area. I mean, to some degree, it's been overlooked for a long time, and as a result of that, it gives us a beautiful time to really look at it and try to make it better than where it's been. Not to say that it was ever bad, because it hasn't been. I'm not going to go down that road. I'm just trying to say is that we can improve upon it, because there's nothing that we haven't dealt with or talked about, I guess is probably the best way of putting it, that we haven't argued one way or another repeatedly. And that's been that's been our strength and our demise all at the same time. But we're really trying to make an attempt here to get things moving now, to get it off of our table, put it onto this, to give it to all the citizens, and see what kind of a reaction, and see if there's any discontent or content with what we're trying to do. In other words, if we can be a little bit more on the proactive side of things and get them involved, that's one thing. If they want to be silent, that's their option as well. And I guess all I'm going to say is, this is our opportunity to see if we can open that door.
Jose and then John. Okay, then John.
Yeah. I think you do need some visions in there. As Dennis mentioned, the railroad depression was in the original comp plan. It was something that became, it was planted in everybody's mind. Hey, we don't have to stop for trains every day. Let's look at how we can prevent that. Mineral Avenue across the river was in the original comp plan, another access across the river besides Bowles. And the South Park Industrial Area, which has since become the South Park Medical Center, but still it was recognized as a regional employment center. So I think you do need some visions in there. They can be accomplished. And, I mentioned that area west of Santa Fe. Someday that's going to develop. Maybe you guys ought to look at what kind of development do we want between Santa Fe and the river.
And we've talked about it, because it's a tricky area.
Yep.
I mean, you've got all the activity, all the traffic up and down Santa Fe, but then you've got the greenway up and down the river. How do you find an activity on one piece of ground that suits both of those assets? And they are assets.
And then you look at the Highway Department's road plan for that area, and there is access back into, backing up to the river and that type. So I think it's good to have some visions in there, and I think that's where good ideas
lean more toward that in identifying our lightning rods for our survey. Is invite that kind of comment now rather than waiting for the dispersed comment and then try and come up with it.
Norm?
I had a question going back to what you talked about, small town character and the different kinds of shops. The current comp plan and its revisions doesn't, as I see it, lead us to sort of the salon, spa, holistic type of businesses that have moved in, yet they have. Is it council's suggestion or direction that then in our comp plan for this central area, that we would try to find a way to encourage what you spoke of, the maybe eclectic as opposed to a Starbucks on every block approach, not chains, but mom and pop operations? Or is that even doable?
I think that that's one of the things that you need to bring to the public and say, you know, these are two alternatives. One of them may be inevitable because of economics. If you want this one, then how hard should we push for that?
I think Dennis or Suzanne can tell us that there's been some recent case studies say if we're going to try and keep chains out in favor of local stuff, we're going to have a problem. There's only so much we can do without transgressing.
Well, your parking already keeps out anything.
Well, well, which is another implication of putting in more parking, and then what happens?
Well, actually, that is an implication of it. Pablo?
Well, speaking of vision and broader direction, one specific question that I have of council, we've seen a lot of talk about Littleton. It's a green thing, and all issues green. To what degree is there interest within council to begin to incorporate issues of sustainability and others within the planning process?
Oh, green. I thought you said a Greek thing.
Yeah. That's all Greek to him. That's a given. I mean, we assume that. I mean, we will sooner or later take hold.
Green.
Green is a very nebulous term, and even sustainability can be used very, very loosely, but there are ongoing efforts, both locally in the Denver-Boulder regional area, as well as others. There's things like transition town movements, the sustainable communities initiatives. There's a lot of other ones. And there's incentives that some municipalities are giving towards LEED certified constructions and stuff like that. I know there's been push towards incentives and waiving fees for solar and other renewable energy applications. Is this something that we want to start looking at a lot more in the Planning Commission? I mean, personally, I'm of the opinion that we should, but this becomes one of those issues that if there isn't interest within council, we can go put a whole bunch of nice words in there, but what's going to be the implementation there? The same thing that when we're talking about maybe we want to revisit the rezoning, the zoning structure of the downtown or the central area. If there isn't any interest on council to actually take a hard look at this, we just put in a lot of nice words there and directions that's going to be like, you know, we should have a mobile home park rezoned to MH. Well, 27 years later, that hasn't happened.
Well, if you put sustainability in, then I think that becomes an implementation of that would become reflected in building codes and perhaps subdivision regulations and things like that. If you all decide that that needs to be a policy in here, then I think that becomes an item that's on an implementation schedule that would then have to get done through some other code.
Right, staff and council.
Yeah. Peggy?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I wrote on my copy of the draft is the sustainability issue. But I have a suggestion. If I understand what you want with open house, that you may want to have your open house before you work on your survey, because a certain kind of open house is going to flesh out some of the differences that people conceive of for the area, and that will then help you draft a survey to see how many people like one thing versus another thing versus another. And also, even though people could respond 100 times to a survey online, you may want to make it something available online where indeed you'd have a very easy way to do pictures, kind of like the eye doctor does with lenses, You know, do you like this lens or that lens better? And you could do something a little sneaky that has a house, very same house with certain kind of vegetation, and or else a very similar house without vegetation, and you'd be seeing, oh, is it the trees they like, or is it the housing type, or multi-housing, or whatever without vegetation, or whatever. But you could give combinations online very easily. It'd be mighty expensive in another format unless you brought people in and had a little visual where they could respond right on site. But again, if not a major open house, then some kind of open house where you could get some of the initial differences to guide the survey.
So we're seeing not only how people respond to the issues we've raised, but what other issues they're going to shotgun us through.
But you might even think of doing is to do some controlled focus groups too. Go in and extract, people specifically from some of the primary demographics, and then do a focus group with them on some of the sample questions and get some feedback that way before going out with it too.
Well, let me throw this out there. We've got 4 different council districts. Is there any interest among those district representatives of having or being a part of that kind of an open house early on in the process? I know, Debbie, you just finished one, so I'm just throwing it out there.
Depending on timing, you might get some people who had, what do you call them, the little parties that they had to meet the candidates. I mean, because different political groups had these various kinds of things, and maybe some of them would be willing to host something.
And that's one of the things that Julio and Pablos have brought up, is identifying, I don't know what you want to call them, community leaders, movers and shakers, whatever, some with organized groups, whether it's the Sunshine Boys or whatever else. Some that aren't necessarily organized, but they're the people that the community listens to when subjects come up. So yeah, that's part of the outreach. One of the things we wanted to look to try and stimulate discussion.
We all have district meetings every year, separate. And the last one was District 1, before that was District 3, but we bring everybody in, or hope they come in, invite them anyway. So we could incorporate some of this at the same time.
If there's interest in it, I think that's something we can incorporate in our planning.
We want to thank you all for the effort and the time that you put into this. I mean, every one of us on council is grateful for the time and the energy that you put on this. We know that it's a lot of work, and we appreciate you volunteering and doing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you for the meeting. Thank you for coming down and updating us.